Good morning, everyone. I look out there and I see so many familiar faces, faces of former students and colleagues and great friends. It feels like a homecoming of sorts. We're here today reflecting together on hope. Hope amidst a financial crisis that has certainly shattered lives. A crisis born of corruption and greed. One that has caused incredible fallout for too many and will do so for years, despite the media reports that the recession is turning around. As I reflect on the virtue of hope and the mandate that is ours as Christians to be hope-filled people, I'm conscious that what in the end may be most salvific about hope is that it defies any cheap theoretical abstraction. Hope can be spoken about adequately only in concrete, incarnate terms. For hope is always placed. One encounters it in the midst of something specific, in the context of something materially real. As such, hope is deeply storied. Its inner mechanisms can be described most effectively in terms of real human faces, actual human lives. Hope is a fleshly virtue, and its insistent fleshliness, therein lies our longed-for redemption, in hope's insistent fleshliness. Its inherent grace is manifest in words, in relational exchanges, images, and in concrete practices. As somebody who works in the field of practical theology, my area of interest is that intersection of theology and spirituality. That is, the relationship between religious reflection and the lived practices of faith. Practical theologians study ways in which the central Christian symbol, God, gets construed, and the human gets interpreted amidst particular existential circumstances and from the standpoint of specific communal and cultural contexts. Practical theologians who work in spirituality studies turn a keen eye toward the kinds of practices that are called forth from live historical contexts, exploring what it is they contribute to an understanding of lived Christian faith. The task of practical theologians is never simply to be discerning with respect to present existential realities in light of the Christian tradition. It is also to propose, to strategize, to flex one's theological imagination in ways that serve to better orient human life. In light of this, I want to begin this second segment of our day by inviting all of you to put on the cap of a practical theologian. So let us together examine more closely this economic crisis, asking what it potentially calls forth from each of us. Wherein lies the promise of God's abundant life here and now in this struggle? Where is God in these hard times? What is it about us that should give us any solace? What are the spiritual practices being called forth now that make creative fidelity in challenging times the more possible? Let's start with the first question and take each of them in turn. So, where is God in these hard times? Where do we locate God in this mess? How do we talk about God? And is there anything about who we are as human beings that should actually cause us to take heart in these hard times? What are some of your thoughts in response? To simplify the terms of the question, who's God amidst the crisis, and who are we? Let's take a couple minutes to discuss that in our circle. All right, we'll take about 4 or 5 minutes in our circle, try to get right around to hear a word from everybody, and I'll be back to you in a short while. Who's God in this mess, and who are we? Where are we locating God in all of this? Huh? Where are we placing God? Who's God? How do we even begin to use God talk amidst this financial crisis? How do we do that with people? How do we do that ourselves? Anybody want to start us off? Who's God in this? Yes.
Someone in our table, so I don't take the credit, said God is love, and we are called to be lovers.
Hey, Michael has to be delighted to hear that. Indeed. That God is the presence of love amidst the mess. Huh? The reality of love that's still possible. Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Who God is. Anybody want to say who God is not in this mess? You do.
I'm just going to state one thing. I think you asked us a different question. We understood that the question was, where is God?
Where is God? Where is God in the mess? What were your thoughts? Anyone from that table?
I think what we said was that God is present in all circumstances of life and in each other, and how we share His love with each other. We talked about Him being in the poor, and
Okay, so God is present in all circumstances of our life. Is God in this mess? God is in it. Anybody want to address that? Yes.
Because God lies within each of us, and we carry God within us. We are Theotokos, God bearers.
Okay. Anyone want to supplement, add, subtract, multiply, divide? Yes.
What
Go ahead.
came up in our group was that there's a terrific disturbance in some of us with the violence worldwide, and the way here in our country we can make all the violence appear only to the world. But the disturbance for us, we know God is present, but we're disturbed by the violence, and it stays with you every day of the day.
You know that there's presence, but you don't want to locate God in the violence, or the corruption, or the greed. Is that fair? Anyone else? Yes.
I think that the events are perspective changing. We view our everyday differently than we did before, depending on the degree that we're impacted or our friends and family are impacted by this crisis. So where is God in that? Well, we have to be able to look for God's wisdom and say, perhaps it's not the same wisdom, human wisdom that I was functioning with, but, as I look at this differently, how do I see it through my eyes of faith? How do I see it through what I believe? And how do I prioritize what's really important? We talked about, this gives us permission to simplify. We don't have to excuse ourselves for that. So we can make that simplicity without making excuses for it. It's a freedom in a way, despite the hardship that people are enduring.
Okay, so this real shift in perspective, and maybe God's in some of that, for sure, as a lure, as a prodding force, as it were, attracting us, beckoning, inviting. Anyone else on this one? Yes.
We were saying that it was the absence of God in the decisions that allowed us to get here, and that God's presence in the midst of it is the hand, is the answer out. So whether it's recognizing the simplicity again, recognizing how we take care of others again, but that's God present. It was the absence of God, or our not recognizing God in our decisions that allowed us to get here.
Okay, so you want to introduce God's absence here as well in this conversation. So we're not locating God in every aspect of what's in front of us. Others, yes.
I'm thinking that God is everywhere in the Bible as a many crisis. And we come to this table about God is the go-to place. And there's an invitation being extended to not necessarily to be introspective, but to look at the other. And even during Bingo, to look at everybody who has been or who has so-called caused this and find our own, we're invited to find our own place in this mess because we believe that we don't have a place in it somewhere. So it's sort of God is where God always was, which is everywhere, in the violence, in the downside, in the dark side. And we're being asked to look out.
Okay, are we hearing different responses? All right. This is a very live question for people. So I think it's good that we grapple with it. We'll continue to grapple with it together. Yes?
Well, we said that we saw God present in the presence with one another, whether it was sitting with a dying person, seeing, friends of ours sitting here, and a spouse died. Just like in 9/11, God was there with all the people helping one another.
So God was in that response to the 9/11 tragedy, but not in the 9/11 reality, the occurrence. Yes?
Well, I believe that each person is given a free will, and God allows you the occasion to use that. And I think the 9/11 tragedy and many tragedies we're experiencing are the result of removing God out of your life and using your free will in an unbeneficial way.
Okay, by moving us to free will, you've moved us to our second question. Who are we who are struggling in the midst of this crisis? What are things about us that come to the forefront amidst this struggle? Did anybody have any ideas on that? Yes?
Well, I think one of the things is that we are people who can remain isolated, or we can connect with others. God is in other people. So when we connect with others and pool ideas and pool faith and pool hope and pool practical solutions,
Yes.
then we're all stronger and more equipped.
Okay.
I think we mentioned that there's a big difference in how we respond to the crisis. We can't avoid the crisis, but we can control our own responses.
Okay, we're people capable of response. We're people who can choose isolation or choose community. Thanks for those. Anybody else? Who are we amidst this crisis? Thank you.
I think sometimes when you're in the crisis, you're so isolated, you need someone to make you aware of it. You're like alone. And some assistance. And I think that's where the church can work together.
And we are people who stand in real need.
Yes.
In this
We need
situation.
others to protect us or to make us more aware that God is with us.
And so we're vulnerable in this. And yourself?
Really just kind of an extension of that. In our vulnerable, in our pain place, the traditional images of godness get jarred.
They do get jarred. Could you say a bit more about that? How they get jarred?
Well, the God who takes care of good people and makes things right and helps people get better because we pray, seems absent.
Doesn't work. Doesn't fit. No. Let's continue along together as we begin to reflect on this question, firstly, of God in the midst of the present crisis. I think it may be wise for us to move in the direction of a via negativa. Do you know what I mean by that? Starting with where God is not in this. Starting with that, necessarily, pastorally speaking. God is definitely not to be found in the root causes of our present crisis. Would we all agree? God is definitely not to be found there. God, after all, neither intends nor wills bad loans, unsecured derivatives, fraudulent dealings, or the activities of greedy, dishonest bankers, unaccountable financial predators, or neglectful government regulators. Nope, there's nothing of God in any of that. And there's never anything of God in human suffering, in hurtful injustice, in the stripping away of people's well-being. So where is God to be found then? In a notable 20th century work from our Christian spiritual tradition, titled The Divine Milieu, the French theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest, geologist, paleontologist, visionary, poet, mystic, describes how it is that God advances toward us, accompanying us in the full milieu in which our lives unfold, accompanying us in a way that can transform even profoundly negative forces in our lives. Now we're talking about accompaniment there, not God's location, right? In terms of the actual struggle or the crisis. Teilhard spends much time reflecting on the diminishments that we experience as humans. Tragedies, breakdowns in direction, obstacles on our paths, illness, going financial belly up, things we undergo that are not of our choosing. Teilhard seeks to know what our best hopes are in the face of what we experience as real, live diminishment. What grounds that hope? Is there in fact any grounding for it? Now these are the very same questions that those experiencing the fallout of our economically troubled times are asking. Who is God in this place? And what does creative fidelity look like in the experience of diminishment? I especially appreciate the wisdom of Teilhard in response to such questions. He urges a courageous perseverance, a cleaving to God who he locates not in the forces of diminishment, never in the forces of diminishment, but rather sees God to be the one who stands across, reaching an arm across that experienced diminishment. Or the God whose two hands are underneath, not in it, but underneath, ever bigger than diminishment. Teilhard offers images that are very helpful to us. This God standing across the diminishment with an outstretched arm. A God who, like a huge bird with tremendous wingspan, hovers over the darkness, accompanying us amidst strife. Now this accompaniment of God, referenced by Teilhard again and again, may well be far and away our very best insurance policy and all we ultimately need. Now, how about the we who find ourselves standing amidst this crisis? Who are we who struggle? Well, we're people who are finding that what we thought was the big American dream is really something in shambles. We're people challenged to acknowledge, in retrospect, that this dream was already in pretty serious need of recasting. Let's face it, folks. Look at what the American dream has come to entail. Listen to these observations offered by Cecil Andrews in the book, The Circle of Simplicity. And I quote, "Couples in America spend an average of 12 minutes a day talking to each other. We spend an average of 40 minutes a week playing with children. Instead of spending relaxed hours over dinner with friends, we eat with one hand as we drive. Most of us would rather get an answering machine than have to spend the time talking to a real person. We've become heavily socialized to think of ourselves and others in terms of our use value and our exchange value predominantly. These are the dominant terms of a commodity culture, after all. Andrews asks, how about the fact that we in the U.S. rank number 1 in numbers of billionaires and number 1 in numbers of children and elderly living in poverty? How about the fact that we have the biggest houses and the most homelessness? How about the fact that our executive salaries are larger here than anywhere? And we rank number 1 for inequality of pay. Look where the American dream has landed us. We're catching sight of something more akin to the American nightmare. It seems like we've become a country that time and time again favors wealth over health. And as the sociologist Juliet Schor estimates, we're all working approximately 1 full month per year more than we did 20 years ago. Where does it end? The we, in the midst of this financial struggle, find ourselves understandably disillusioned, justifiably angry, disgusted at what we now know about corporate executive financial salaries and bonuses, banks and loans, government regulators. But there are some other things to realize about ourselves at this time. Some other things. Yes, we've been living with illusions, and that has to be put front and center as we think about us amidst this struggle. But even more significantly, we have been created with a capacity to bounce. Yeah. The law of levity is as apparent in our being as the law of gravity. We are resilient creatures who can choose to exercise the capacity to bounce. We are able to deal with, overcome, learn from, and even be transformed by adversities. Amidst life's stresses and genuine suffering and loss, we as human beings in residence have tools to enhance what is our God-given natural resilience. We are capable of availing ourselves of resources, of discerning, of choosing well, of decluttering and recentering and creating. This is indeed the time and the hour to acknowledge these important aspects of how we've been created. So, okay, let's turn our focus now, putting on that cap of practical theologians again, to the 2 other questions raised. What does creative fidelity in this time entail? What does creative fidelity look like in terms of specific practices? What are your ideas about that? What spiritual practices are called forth in this economic crisis? To what are you invited? To what are we invited as communities of faith? Let's get back to our circle and have a discussion about it. The practices called forth at this time. Personally, communally, what creative fidelity means, what it looks like. Okay, we've got some lively conversation out there. Let's pull the wisdom of the group regarding practices. What do you think are spiritual practices called forth specifically at this time, amidst this struggle? Yes, thank you.
I think we talked about intercessory prayer, but also just the presence of being, the spiritual practice of being with the person in their trouble, sitting with them, listening to them, not necessarily trying to solve all the problems, because we may not be able to, but being with them in that struggle and in that process for themselves.
Okay, thanks for that. Intercessory prayer is being suggested, as well as lending a good ear. Huh? And, we should probably unpack what we're meaning by intercessory prayer in all of this, right? Because sometimes intercessory prayer is presented as though we're doing this to move God somehow to do something else. Okay, and I don't know about you, but I don't think intercessory prayer is about that at all. Since Augustine has been quoted so much today, let's go back to Augustine's mom. As we know, Augustine had a very unusual relationship with his mother, all right? And psychologists would have a heyday with the relationship between Monica and Augustine. We know she was a bit of an overbearing character in Augustine's life. So much so that when Augustine pulled up in his boat, hearing that his mother was on the shore, he quickly turned and set the boat in another direction. And we know that for years, the wild and woolly Augustine wandered, saying, no, not yet, no, not yet, sensing something happening within in terms of the tug of God's own Spirit, but not ready for any of that yet. And Monica the whole time was hell-bent on her son's conversion, right? And so Monica prays with her all for this wayward son's conversion. And the question becomes, what effect did Monica's prayer have on any of this? Do we really think that God needed Monica's prayer? No, God didn't need Monica's prayer. But did that prayer have effect? What effect did it have on Monica? Someone feeling very estranged from this son. And yet having this resource, this practice, being able to sense still connection. Connection. A hugely important thing. For Monica, the prayer. And how about the impact of Monica's intercessory prayer on the wayward son? The one who knows, my crazy mother is praying somewhere for me. Who knows that? Somewhere, at some level in his being, senses this mother who is not given up on him. He may wish that she would, but he's sensing that that mother is not given up on him. So the effect of that prayer on the prayer, the effect of that prayer on the one prayed for, and the fact that we're pulled into this grand undertow of God in the practice of intercessory prayer. Thank you for that. Other thoughts? Yes.
To follow on the mother image, we talked here about the fact that in the time of crisis, we in ministry often respond as the mother, which is to respond to everybody else's needs and neglect our own. And so that while it is important to respond to others, we need to carve out the time for ourselves, for our own prayer life and for our own rebuilding, or we're no good to anybody else.
Yeah. Do you ever notice in ministry how much of others' pain actually gets into our body? Have you had that experience? So you're absolutely right with respect to being able to stay attentive to good self-care. Okay. Others, yes.
One of the things we said was keep showing up. You know?
Keep showing up.
Amid everything, both following that comment with what you need to do for yourself,
Yes.
and also being with others. But you just keep showing up.
Yeah.
And
Especially since some of the people who are very angry, very saddened, very disappointed, very hurt in the midst of this, are likely to throw all of the pots and the pans at the ministerial presence who shows up. Right? Yes. Anybody else? Yes.
You look back at the crisis situation in the life, and you see how God is redeeming after that, after the Holy Spirit, after the crisis, after your life come away. You're not always remembering, right? And you see that this still is life.
So are you suggesting that we remember?
Yes.
That we remember? You know, in the Jewish tradition, meditation has everything to do with a deep remembering. A deep remembering how God has been with God's people in the past. Right? A deep remembering of that. There's power in that deep remembering. Yes?
What about Hegel people? Mentioned that they kind of even got down to the fact that maybe we need a little reconciliation with our God and repentance because we ourselves have been brought into this materialism world and we kind of come on to that white picket fence. We expected it and wanted it for ourselves. So we were trying to, be God and kind of leave God behind and not take him into the process with us. And by doing that, realizing our part, and we could just show up for God and say, God, what do you want me to do today? So more of an individual sense instead of blaming someone else. Okay, even as individuals, we have been caught up in this.
Okay, so every one of us in a chair or on 2 feet today stand implicated in this, you are saying. In some way, we have all contributed, right? And in that way, we stand in need of mercy, the largesse of God. And what do we do with that? What do we do with that individually? What do we do with that communally? Yes. Uh-huh.
I was given a gift a few weeks ago through a retreat at Glastonbury Abbey on contemplative prayer.
Beautiful place.
And the new abbot gave on Friday night a talk where he spoke about the illusion of separation, and he spoke to us about the gift of baptism, that in that sacrament we receive everything we need because we receive the Spirit of God within ourselves. And that to connect with that, particularly in times like this.
All right, calling us back to some of the central symbols of our tradition and how they speak now in a little different way amidst this specific concrete historical event. Yes, Monique.
The thing that came to my mind was when you were saying how little time we spend playing games with our children and relate to them having children, or how much time we watch TV, we're disconnected with each other. What I noticed is a brief that is very helpful is slowing down enough to be present in the present and aware. Because we tend, and I love the possibilities and level that, we tend to miss the blessings. And so in the midst of the intense grief, we tend to miss what's truly important. And one of the things that we're sharing before is how sometimes we discover communities that have very little, that are in much more shape than we are now. How much joy and faith we discover in these areas, because there are other things that we're not noticing.
Okay, so you're calling us to slow down and to notice the blessings. Mary Jo Letty has a beautiful book entitled Radical Gratitude, in which she describes this as a central Christian practice, radical gratitude. Something Michael Hines was inviting us all to look at as well. Yes?
And our thing when we were talking to Karen, I think the really different direction was that simplify, letting go of some of these things that we have held as you have to do, and giving it to not just at work, but people in our lives who need us, family and friends, and being able, so more than, I guess, in combination with the spirit
Yes.
Spending time together, maybe a simple meal together. It doesn't need to be something extravagant, but to very simplify.
Sure. The invitation to simplify and what an exercise of simplification may look like. What does that look like for each of us? What does that look like in community? Because we have far too little forums for that. What might that look like? Okay, let's gather some of these. Those are wonderfully rich responses, and assemble them. Areas of practice for us all, and I will add on to some of what you have already suggested. Practices of prayer, of silence, of meditation, because they serve to anchor us amidst turmoil. Isn't that what they do, huh? They lend such perspective. Hearkening back to what Michael Himes shared with us earlier, you know, we do have trouble with our finitude, huh? And it's in the practice of prayer that we sense the grace of finitude. When Michael Himes said there's something really good about our finitude, I found myself at the end wanting to raise my hand and say, you know, tell me again why finitude is good, because most mornings I really need to know again why finitude is good. And we go to prayer to find out why it is that the way we've been created is so good. Because our beauty as human beings has everything to do with our making peace with our finitude. Our beauty is dependent on our knowing that deeply. And we can't make peace with our finitude without the interconnectedness and interdependence of community. But I really do believe that one of the things that happens in prayer is that we get to say to God, tell me again why my creatureliness, why my finitude is a good thing. You know, Tom and I are, many of you know, the adoptive parents of a beautiful little boy. And he so frequently wants to hear the story of how he was created over and over and over. Every bit of it, from going to the hospital to receive him and having too big a little suit, and it was wintertime, and he slipped right down to the feet of the suit because he was very premature, and he just revels in the details of his story. And prayer gives us a chance to hear again why our finitude is so good, why our beauty has everything to do with the way that we have been made. So prayer, silence, meditation, these things anchor us amidst the turmoil. A morning offering of gratitude for being, for all that we do have, for our families, our friends, our health, our agency. That can be a really rich way to dispel negativity and lend perspective. A morning offering of gratitude. A second area of practice, as persons are vulnerable to stress in this economic climate, especially the toxic effects caused by chronic stress, job loss, foreclosures, concerns about retirement, that'll all cause chronic stress. Well, self-care becomes this huge and important spiritual practice. Spiritual. We don't often think about self-care as spiritual practice. Now, when we say self-care, we're not talking about what Shirley MacLaine might mean by it. We're not talking about Grecian mud baths, etc. We're speaking here about sleep and good nutrition and exercise and intentional time for leisure. The things that are never more needed than when we're facing hard times. Making room for beauty becomes an essential spiritual practice as well. Whether that means surrounding ourselves with what brings simple pleasure and delight, taking walks in nature, listening to beautiful music, craft work, creating art, etc. We are renewed by such practices. We're brought home to deeper realities, reminded again of all that we are. We come alive. Household economics. How about that as a spiritual practice? That's an essential one at this time. How will we now think about managing our money? And what does it mean to discern this in the context of our faith? What is good and just economic practice right now? What does it mean for us to proceed from the premise of a spirituality of enoughness? What seems called for in a very strong way these days is more palpable relationship between our spiritual and our economic lives. Finally then, making space for friends becomes a rich spiritual practice. And this has been hinted at already in our discussion. We need our friends as we undergo the losses that come with this economic upheaval. We've never needed them more. We need them for support, for exchange of ideas, for helping us to articulate hopes and concerns. You know, it's much easier to initiate changes in lifestyle movements toward greater simplicity with a community of friends. We shouldn't go about that alone. If we can, we may be able to join a simplicity circle, a group of like-minded people who choose to share in conversation about basic ways of simplifying their lives, some of their family decisions with respect to that. Now, our list of practices is suggestive and by no means exhaustive. The important thing, I think, is to have one and to continue considering what practices are called forth at this time and what makes the kind of creative fidelity, right? Faithfulness, but not the same old kind of faithfulness that we're used to, because something new is being brought forth here. Something new is required here. A kind of creative fidelity that is in keeping with God's own spirit of resilience within us. You know, the Russian playwright Chekhov once noted in his inimicable way, and I quote, "Any idiot can face a crisis. It's the day-to-day living with it that wears you out." So, we're about spiritual practices that invoke soul, that provide might and wisdom and solace, that will prevent us from wearing out in the day-to-day. Frederick Flock has written, and I quote, "Periods of stress represent unique opportunities to develop or strengthen those resilient qualities that are not our strongest suits." End of quote. The present economic crisis presents us with more than losses and reasons for anxiety. It also affords us some very real possibilities. The possibility of consciously choosing a more simple existence, of taking charge of our life anew, of more direct contact with real life. It presents us with a chance to redefine our standards of success and prosperity, to surround ourselves with what we know brings more lasting fulfillment, to figure out how much is enough. Backhanded gifts, the Shaker tradition would say. Gold dust strewn sideways from a most generous hand, if we had the eyes to see, some might assert. Something for us all to ponder. I'd like, by way of closing, to invite you to join me in a closing prayer that was written by a 20th century spiritual giant, Evelyn Underhill, a married laywoman in ministry, a poet, a mystic, a strong theological presence. And this is the prayer offered by Underhill. Now and then, some great emotion, some devastating visitation of beauty, love, or pain lifts us to another level of consciousness. And we are aware for a moment of the difference between what seems reality to us and the height the depth and the breadth of that which is truly real. Our focus is sharpened. Our landscape widens to one that is more brilliant, more significant, more detailed, more real. The material for a more intense life, a wider, sharper consciousness, a more profound understanding of our own existence, lies at our gates. A more intense life awaits us. We are invited to vitalize our latent faculties, to arouse our languid consciousness, to emancipate our spirit from the fetters of appearances, to turn our attention to new levels of the world. Let's be about it. Thank you very much.